Listening to that passage, the clarity of your intended impact upon the reader, to offer a sense of queer men's lived experience within the texture of that contemporary social fabric is really striking. But what we also get is not only the sense of, okay, here are the materials that we find these men in, but also the places. So you generate a kind of, for me at least, a queer geography of London through parks, lavatories, pubs, streets. But it's built out of fragments of very different lives and perspectives placed alongside one another. So I wonder what kind of role movement the city played in shaping your depiction of this mosaic of queer men's lives?
Well, I think when I was commissioned to write this book, I think my editor imagined that it was largely going to be a book centred on Soho, which is famous, and Fitzrovia as well, probably famous for its various bohemian clubs. But the minute I started thinking about it and then wrote a proposal, I wanted to widen this enormously. And one of the ways I wanted to widen it was that although it was all going to be set in London, I wanted to include all parts of London, or as many as I could. So I didn't want just Soho clubs. I wanted pubs in the East End and saunas up north and squalid pubs down in Brixton. And I think that also gives you a sense of the geography. And a lot of the material I found was very specific. There were certain public lavatories that were notorious, as the police put it. And one of the most notorious was right next to the Archbishop's Palace in Lambeth, which seemed a nice juxtaposition. It was in Archbishop's Park. And I wanted to give a sense of where these places were and how they operated. And of course, you also got different areas with different magistrates handing out often different types of punishment. And a lot of the material that was submitted to the Wolfenden report, there are wonderful maps. There's a terrific map of Hyde Park, which was a centre of homosexual activity. One magistrate said if he had his way, he would floodlit the whole place at night to prevent what was going on there, heterosexual as well as homosexual. And the police produced maps with little red circles for arrests made for different homosexual offences. And I wanted to sort of contrast that map with the invisible map of people who would patronise a pub or a club that was then raided. They would then move to another, like mosquitoes, as one unsympathetic magistrate put it. And this idea that it was a very fluid society, that although there were lots of sort of posh gay men who only like rough trade, there was this myth put about, particularly when the Wolfenden report was being debated in Parliament, that, and actually I regret to say this was mostly by Labour MPs who said that, my constituents won't stand for this. They're solid working class men and homosexuality is completely unknown among the working classes, unless, of course, they've been corrupted by their social superiors. And this was one of the myths that I was determined to bust, because I looked at court records, and actually a lot of the court records, you get names, and in some of them you get occupations. And the sort of number of manual workers and things actually far outnumbered the usual suspects, the window dressers, actors, clergymen, the sort of people we always imagine being hauled up in court.
How dare you?
So I did want to make it get a proper geographical spread, and I was particularly pleased to find stuff in I live in Mile End, and my local history library had material from a social worker who worked particularly with immigrants and with gay men, and some of the diaries that were kept about sort of going around all the pubs and naming the pubs and naming what was going on was absolutely fascinating, and so I was very pleased to find that.
Thank you. So, and you did, it's very evident you have this really wide spread of depictions of different classes and them speaking in their own voice as well as being reported. But I noted the absence of black and non-white voices, and was that to do with the material that you could access, or?
It is largely. I mean, it's really like a lot of the working class voices, that they come from court reports and police records rather than anything else. But I mean, I was very pleased to find, I can't remember how I came across it, Andrew Sulky's Escape to an Autumn Pavement, which is a novel written by a Jamaican who lived here, a West Indian. He might not have been Jamaican. And it is a book about a middle-class Jamaican who is living in London and is bisexual, and it's about him having an affair with a woman he works with in a club, but also he's living with a gay man who is in love with him, and he has to decide, as it were, which way he was going to go, and I thought that was fascinating because it really was. And then there were things like Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners, not a gay writer, not a gay book, but has a fantastic bit in it about a sort of macho black man who's picked up by what he thinks is a very statuesque woman, and of course turns out to be a drag queen. There is a slight problem because one of the best writers about black life in London in fiction is Colin McInnes, who of course was white. But, I think although these days there is some sort of disquiet about white writers writing about, I mean, he did know a lot of Africans in Notting Hill, and he was the first person to write fiction about the Notting Hill riots, but he also has a lot of gay and straight black as well as white people in it, and I thought he should be given credit for that. Working classes, again, it's quite difficult. I mean, Frank Norman's novel, the name of which escapes me, Stand on Me, is extraordinary because it's written in working class demotic and often quite hard to understand because he just wrote as he spoke. And that gave a good voice. But often you think, hurrah. I remember reading online, I think, that the Bishopsgate Institute, which has a fantastic collection of LGBTQ plus material, they'd taken charge of some diaries by a working class man who'd lived with his lover in Brixton. And he was called William Marney, and he does appear right at the end of the book. And I thought, oh God, this is fantastic, this is going to be gold dust. And when I started reading it, it was got up, read the papers, went off to work, Doug went off to work, came back, washed the bath, page after page after page. And you think, and then I thought, which I have put in the book, right, what happens when the Sexual Offences Act is passed? Got up, went to work, absolutely nothing. There was occasional mention of going to the Salisbury pub, the famous once gay pub. And you do get that, but not that. But unfortunately, what I really then found in the diaries, and it was in the 70s, so beyond my thing, is when Doug dies. And then in every diary entry ends, "Good night, Doug, I miss you. Good night, Doug, I miss you." And if you read the diaries, you would just think they were two friends, unless the only hint of their relationship until Doug dies is that he refers to the bedroom and the bed rather than bedrooms and beds. So it's quite tricky finding these voices, and I wish I could have found more.
Thank you. You mentioned there with Doug, the Sexual Offences Act, that passes, yet nothing seems to change for him. And you do, there's a sense, and you mentioned this at the end, or even at the beginning, of Volume 2, that despite, spanning quite, several decades, and these being periods of pivotal social change in many ways, very little changed for gay men in the decades that you cover. Did you feel any pressure, whether that's from public expectation for this sort of, the 60s where everything changes, or from publishers to produce a sense of movement or transformation for those that you were writing about?
Well, one reviewer did say that, the second volume was more upbeat, but I wanted to be very clear that the swinging 60s, they might have swung for heterosexuals, but they didn't actually make, gay men could still be sent to prison. And it was always said that swinging London was invented by three men, all of whom were gay, all of whom could be sent to jail. So I didn't want it to be too sort of, oh, hurrah, hurrah. and very upbeat. And as I say, in fact, when the Sexual Offences Act was passed, partially decriminalising homosexual acts, prosecutions for homosexual acts that still remained illegal, otherwise in public, like in public rights, actually went up. So, you know, it's not a cheerful story. Talking about the change in the law and how it affected people, one of the few pieces that I was forbidden to reproduce was from Joe Orton's diaries, and they were published, but this was back in, when were they published? In the 80s, I think, or perhaps the 90s. And it shows how our perceptions and our concerns have changed, because there's a wonderful bit, and I wanted to juxtapose it with William Marney doing his hoovering, rather than noticing the Sexual Offences Act. Joe Orton goes to see his agent, the wonderful Peggy Ramsey, who's usually sort of very upfront normally. And she says, well, Joe, you must be pleased, you know, now everything's legal. He said, makes no difference to me, I'm only interested in fucking 14-year-olds. Now, it's not true, of course, but it's very Joe Orton. It's what he would say, of course. And the Orton estate wouldn't allow me to reproduce this, even though it was in the diaries. And I think that shows how our ideas of what is acceptable sexually shifts over the period. And so, you know, I'm very sorry that didn't get in, but there we go.
So, but you do nevertheless include, you know, there are reports of child prostitution where, or underage prostitution rather, of pederastic acts of rape, of let's say, power imbalanced relationships throughout. You don't shy away from those different topics that, you know, we as audience might find uncomfortable.
Well, I think people at the time would have found that less uncomfortable, but I also think it's very important not to try and whitewash history. You know, there was a book called The Homosexual Society, I think, and this man interviewed lots of gay men, and there were several sociological books like this, but this particular one by Richard Hauser, who was actually married to Yehudi Menuhin's sister, and she co-wrote the book, but actually she was a sociologist, but her name was left off it for some reason, whether she thought she didn't want her name attached to it. But there was an extraordinary series of interviews with teenage rent boys who were all fantastically cheerful and saying, oh yeah, you know, I like to spend money on getting my hair done, so I'm nicer than his fat wife back at home, and things like this. You know, they're often off with married men. And I think those voices needed to be heard. And I thought, you know, if we start trying to censor this stuff or remove it from the record, you're not seeing, I mean, well, one of the really shocking things about the Wolfenden Report, and I put it in the book and I haven't got the statistics here, but the tables I mentioned at the back, there is a whole category of people, I think under the age of 15, who were not people who were involved with older men and they were therefore victims of sexual crimes, but actually people who were convicted and sent to Borstal for homosexual relationships. So I think, you know, in this period, it was much less shocking that young people were involved in sexual relationships with each other or with older people than it would be now. Speaking of difficult topics, I wonder if we can pivot to your anthologies to your single life biographies, as it were. So the subjects, your subjects, J.R. Ackley and Christopher Isherwood's were to take from George in A Single Man, they were not angels. So while queer historians have critiqued queer life writing's tendency towards reclamation or a kind of hagiography, you don't shy away from to staying with what's troubling about your subjects. In fact, an Isherwood scholar recently suggested that you do not love your protagonists. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Well, there are two things there. I didn't know about this till you told me about it 2 days ago. It was actually a review of Kate Bucknell's recent biography of Isherwood, and it was comparing the two and saying that, in fact, Don Bacardi, Isherwood's partner, had complained I did not love Isherwood. Well, it would seem to me that this is not a position any biographer should hold. If you love your subject too much, you can't possibly be objective. As I said to people those people who didn't like the biography and said, oh, you didn't like Isherwood, my answer is, I'm not interested in writing hagiography. And Isherwood would be the last person who would want a hagiography written about him. Secondly, if you're not going to deal with people's failings as writers, I mean, some of Isherwood's books are not as good as others. And if you try and pretend they're all good and not separate the wheat from the chaff, that's doing his literary reputation a disservice. So I always say that if you really think I didn't like Isherwood, why do you think I spent 12 years with him? No one, he drove me around the bend sometimes, like in any relationship. I found him infuriating sometimes, and then sometimes I found him sort of heartbreakingly charming, or charm is what he had, and it is a pretty dangerous thing. But, some of his writing about his various love affairs is very moving, and I was moved by it. So there's that. As for difficult topics, in Isherwood's case, there was a strong streak of anti-Semitism and an even stronger streak of misogyny. And I think if you don't actually at least state that these things happened, that there were these attitudes, then you're not giving people the full person. And what I didn't want to do is, which happens in some biographies, which I won't mention, where biographers take a sort of high moral stand and they wag their fingers over their subjects. Oh, he said this terrible thing about Jews, or, he was awful things about women. And actually, I don't think that's helpful. What I think biographies should lay out the evidence and let the reader be the judge. I don't think we should be the judge. I think you can nudge, and I do nudge, but we were talking earlier that confronting his misogyny, what I did was deal with it in a lightly ironic manner, and I sort of channeled Isherwood's own writing about women, saying, that women were, a nuisance because they sort of turned perfectly nice boys into heterosexuals, and they produced sort of squadrons of awful screaming children. So I sort of did it in a light fashion, and then I went on to anti-Semitism and just started Jews also got under his skin, which I thought was, a way of going into it and then explaining. But so as not to sort of, I don't want to take a moral stance and be holier than thou with my subject. I think that's a very unconstructive way to write a biography.
So there is something, and the passage you're referring to, you are, as you say, you're embodying you're playing Isherwood, particularly a single man, the sort of the endless lists of insults that come out, and even the accumulation of misogyny that we see in the diaries, entry after entry after entry, and it's certainly jarring. So there is a sense of sort of performance and play and even camp, perhaps, and of sending up. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think Isherwood himself would, often it was, in A Single Man, which, there is a sort of diatribe against families, and it's very, very funny. And, this is, the film of A Single Man I actually enjoyed, but it's so not the book. And I think the moment where the immaculately suited Colin Firth goes into his faculty, and he sort of sniffs. There's a woman sitting there, arpège, I think. Well, Isherwood wouldn't know one woman's perfume from another. It's a sort of ludicrous. But, A Single Man is actually a book about minorities, and also it's that, that he wanted to show that actually minorities get very, very angry, and they have every reason to be angry. And he does it by introducing various others. So there's a black student, there's a Japanese student, and there are these various people who are all having, all feel oppressed in some way. And I think that's, in a way, it was his sort of manifesto. But it's done in a very funny way. And there's a wonderful bit about sort of heterosexuals thinking they're liberal and their liberal views of, they're perfectly all right, really. And there's this long thing, and it says, they can even have partners, and it sort of goes this list of what partners might be, ending better still dead, which is what actually is the Isherwood character's partner has been killed in a car crash. And again, I think that's the sort of humour he had that I sort of channeled, or I hope I channel, not always, but in certain passages.
And we feel that as well in the Ackley. And you mentioned in your introduction that it is a little, Ackley is self-deprecating a little bit, and at the same, and you are also sending him up a little bit.
Yes, what I say is that actually, one of the things about Ackley is Ackley's half-sister, who became a great friend, Diana Peter, who wrote a wonderful book about Ackley's father's other family, of which she was one of the daughters, called The Secret Orchard of Roger Ackley. And she said to me, "Oh God, you must be so depressed writing about Joe." And actually, not at all. I found myself sitting in very respectable, quiet university libraries in America, just suddenly bursting out laughing, because although he moaned sort of terribly about his life, it was always done for the amusement of other people. It was tended to be in letters rather than in diaries. And they could be very funny in a very dark way. He had a sister who was sort of battened on him. She'd had unfortunate marriage, and she suffered from various mental illnesses, and they lived together in this very sort of like a horrible parody of a marriage. And there's a bit where Nancy was always threatening, I'm going to take an overdose, I'm going to run under the next bus. And there's just a very funny bit where he says, Nancy threatening to throw herself out of the window, so inconsiderate of passers-by. And there is something about that black comedy, but he also used it about himself, and I think more so than Isherwood. I think he had Isherwood could be very funny as well, but I think Ackley could be much funnier about himself. Isherwood was much vainer than Ackley. Ackley had a sort of physical vanity, but I think he realised. He says in The End of My Father, Myself, I realised what a poor figure I cut in these pages. It didn't stop him presenting himself as sort of someone whose life had been sort of shambolic and hopeless and complicated and chasing after the wrong people. And I think that was his great strength, that he could see the comic side of his often very miserable reports. And I think all his friends must have actually loved getting these letters where he was moaning on, because they were so funny.
I feel like to move forward, as opposed to Some Men in London, we do get that humour, that contrast in the way, in your both the setting out, the structuring of those texts, and also in your commentary. We have a description of gay men being sent to prison, and you will say sometimes that might have been the place to continue those relationships, for example. You put it far more elegantly than I do. Would you say that you learned from those lives that you were writing about previously in terms of tone?
I don't know, I probably did. I think because irony is my default mode, so it tends to happen even without me thinking about it. But one of the things about doing Some Men in London is if it had just been a dismal history of prosecutions, blackmail, suicide, it would have been unreadable. Mm-hmm. And I did want to get a balance between all those miserable things and the fun that young man had referred to in the book as well. And I could do that in various different ways. The book is laid out in fairly strict chronology, but so that if a court case was taking place in January and then a play was on in February, I would keep that order. But of course, we'd never know with books the exact, unless you do a lot of research, the exact date they were published. So extracts from novels and other books and play and things like that could be moved around within it, so that I could get the juxtapositions that strict chronology wouldn't allow. But at the same time, when I was putting it together, I was very clear about how one thing should lead on to another. if I had two things, one would seem better as a lead-on, even if the material wasn't necessarily as interesting. So I would do it in that way. And also writing the commentary, again, I wanted to lighten the tone. And also I think that's it was very much of that period. It was a gay men's thing that, it's the whole camp thing that you laugh about things that are serious and you joke about, things that are perhaps even tragic because that's a way of dealing with it. So I hope that was a reflection of the period, as well as a sort of something to stop my readers bursting into tears every page and throwing the book out of the train window.
I think it's a study in I hate the word resilience, but I want to use that. That's what I'm reaching for. And what comes to mind is that the David Halperin quote about camp. So camp works to drain the suffering that it also does not deny.
Yes.
Something I really felt reading the anthologies.
Yes, but of course Isherwood was the first person in fiction to describe camp in his very worst novel, unfortunately, The World in the Evening, where he introduced a couple that I can't remember in the book, seemed to me Disney gays. They were so good and sweet and bouncy and that they were absolutely nauseating. But, he was doing it for a very good reason. But he does have a whole passage of what camp is. And I think Susan Sontag, in her essays on camp, quotes this as the sort of the origin of the first sort of proper description of what camp was.
All interlinked.
Yeah.
So I think now we'll move to some audience questions. We've got two lovely assistants at the back with mics. So we had this person here.
Hello. Just to draw a link between the last veteran and Some Men in London, I'm conscious that the subjects of the latter are still within living memory quite substantially. So I'm wondering if you had any conversations or interviews, or how you handled that side of the material, given that they're also going to be trailing off, maybe not at quite the rate of World War I veterans.
No. Well, one of the things I decided right from the beginning is that I would have nothing in Some Men in London that wasn't written, said, or published during that period. So there was no interviewing people about what it was like. So, for example, seminal queer book, Quentin Crisp's The Naked Civil Servant, was published in 1968, as indeed was Accolades, so they couldn't go in. Because I wanted it to... The thing is, if you ask people about things in the past, you're getting a different perspective on it. I wanted it to be what it was like at the time and how it was recorded at the time, rather than asking people, I know enough old gay men that I could have said, what was it like down the Salisbury in 1949 or something. But I just wanted it to be completely, it was the thing my editor and I agreed with right from the start, that we would have nothing that was retrospective. Everything was there at the time. And so I think one could write, there are several books of at the LSE, they have the Carpenter Hall Archives, and they have done books where they've interviewed elderly gay men recalling stuff. And I took a few things from those, not quotes, but from commentaries. There was the wonderful thing that people saying, these baths, people going to these baths and picking each other up. And the YMCA, apparently, for one glorious period, banned swimming costumes on the grounds that they were unhygienic, with predictable results. So there were a few things that I gathered from those books, but I didn't want to use them because they were retrospective.
Hi, thank you. Peter, that was wonderful. Could you say something a little more about the evolving form of biography? You talked very interestingly about the 800 pages of Isherwood and then DNB and smaller pieces. And what do you think the future is? Is there still a space for the big biography, or is the way people consume information these days through Substack and other things going to affect what's published?
Well, there are people in this audience who are still writing full-length biographies, and very good ones, and I think there's always a place for those. I think you get to a point, particularly if you're writing about 20th century lives, where you're doing a second biography or a third biography, and there have been ones before. Now, I don't think any biography is definitive, regardless of people have said my Isherwood biography is definitive. It's not. There's always going to be someone else who's going to come along and write another one. Indeed, Catherine Bucknell, who edited Isherwood's Diaries, published a new biography of Isherwood 20 years after mine, and that's fine. People say, "Oh, aren't you out? Oh no, how dare she encroach?" And I said no, and Kate and I have done stuff together, and so. But I think there does come a point where you think, oh, yet another biography of so-and-so. It's a bit like Lucian Freud exhibitions. You think, oh, God, there's another one. There was one only last year. I mean, the one at the National Portrait Gallery is very good. But, I nearly didn't go to it because I thought, I've seen so many of them. But each one is slightly different. And obviously, biographers bring their own personality, even though they, I don't like biographers where the biographer is actually a character waving from the sidelines. But, I think the personality of a biographer will always be, to some extent, in that. And that's why biographies will be different, and people will look at the same evidence and draw different conclusions. I don't want to do another a full-length biography. But I'm very happy for other people to do it. But I do think that perhaps we are getting to a place where people are beginning to write, as it were, a book about Isherwood in Berlin and taking a particular aspect of someone's life rather than trying to do the whole cradle to grave. That there are biographies that, start, the Isherwood family was first recorded in the Domesday Book, and it's the Anthony Pole type of biography. Oh God, can we get it? I mean, I deliberately started Isherwood with him on his deathbed. I thought that's a good place to start, though his family history is very interesting, and it did go in. But I think that is the difficulty with cradle to grave. You do feel you have to get everything in, and I think it's quite interesting to read books that actually take a particular aspect of a writer's life, or a particular period of, or a painter, or whoever it may be, or a particular period of their life, or something that you can do more discreetly. And in a way, that was sort of what I was doing with the Housman book. As I said, I didn't want to write a full biography of Housman, but I wanted a proper biographical presence. And some of the reviews said, it's a book it's 3 books for the price of 1, because there's the book about a Shropshire lad, there's a biography of Housman, and then we printed the whole of a Shropshire lad as an appendix at the back. And I thought that was an interesting way to do it. So I think possibly life writing, it's always evolving, and as I say, the cradle to grave will always be there and very welcome. But I think there are ways to do things differently and to just concentrate on some aspect, which I think may be what people are moving towards.
Peter, that was wonderful. This question follows straight on from that, actually. I was very struck that you talked about Forster as your good angel hovering over your right shoulder when you write. And I wanted to know whether you think Forster has been well served by his biographers, and whether you think that if there were to be another biography of Forster now, whether it would need to take on completely different ways of thinking about him, and whether the point about biographies being endlessly redone, as you say, is that it's not just that biographers bring different personalities to the table, but they are also writing at times when different things can be said or more can be said.
Yes.
So I would like you to describe what you think a hypothetical new biography of Forster, for instance, could now be like.
Yes, I mean, I think Nick Furbank's 2-volume is extremely good, but it was written at perhaps a period where he couldn't, or Nick didn't want to write as much about Forster's. I mean, when I was doing the research for Ackley. Before Ackley, I had sort of got this image of Forster as this rather sort of old nanny figure telling people off and rather prim. And actually, when you read his letters, particularly to people like Ackley, about picking up guardsmen and disasters, trying to pick up a guardsman in Hyde Park and suddenly overcome by a bout of diarrhea and having to go behind a tree, the most unromantic. So learning about Forster through Ackley was a complete eye-opener. I think the Nicola Bowman book just won't do. I mean, I know Nicola and I like her, but I just don't think that biography quite sort of got to where it should have done. Whereas I think Wendy Moffat's book is a sort of coming back to actually sort of concentrate on Forster as a sort of a physical being, which we didn't really have before. I've often thought about, if I was writing about Forster, if I wanted to write a book about Forster, what would I write? And I think there are all sorts of things. And I mean, one is about Forster in India. There have been books, and Professor Das here is the big expert on this. But I think, Forster's been quite badly dealt with by some gay historians because they said, oh, he's such a coward. He wouldn't publish Morris while he was alive. And there was a whole pamphlet called With Downcast Gaze. And it has a whole passage. It's mainly about queer self-oppression. And it's got a whole passage about what a traitor to the cause Forster was and how all these gay men go about Forster, and he's a complete disgrace. And these people just hadn't done their research, because in fact, when I was doing research for Some Men in London, I mean, Forster gave enormous amounts of money to things like the Homosexual Law Reform Society. I mean, very substantial amounts of money. He helped A.E. Dyson to write the letter that was published in the Times calling for the Wolfenden Report's recommendations. He wrote various letters to the press about homosexuality, complaining about, he may not have published Morris, but he was doing all these other things. So I think actually a sort of a book about Forster as a sort of a more actively political, in the broader sense, character would be interesting. I mean, there was this project which, alas, I was put forward to work on it, to do a complete edition of Forster's letters, and then the main editor died, and then the whole thing just collapsed. But I think Forster's letters are really wonderful. I mean, not all of them. Often they're, meet me off the 2:40 train. But, some of them are really interesting, and I think the edition we have could be massively expanded.
We're going to wrap things up, I'm afraid, but given, you have perhaps some Forster on the horizon, I wonder if you could tell us what's next. Will there be a third volume of Some Men in London, and will it include aspects from your own time in London?
Well, that's precisely why I'm not doing it, because it's not history for me. I mean, there are two reasons. The number of times I've been asked, not least by my editor, who has actually retired, so is not asking any longer for a third volume. The blandishments of Alan Hollinghurst have not worked on me, who said there must be a third volume. And the number of people who say, why don't you write a third volume? Well, one, I think that the two volumes stand alone and it'll look like a sort of a rather unfortunate coda and a cashing in. The other thing is that actually, as a writer, I'm much, much more interested in repression than I am in liberation. And I think writing about gay liberation, I was on those marches, so I don't need to, I work for the Gay Switchboard. I don't really want to do this because it's not history for me. I don't want to bring myself into it. And I just think that those two books stand on their own, taking a particular period. If I wrote anything else on similar lines, it would not be an anthology, it'd be more history, and I'd move back in time rather than forwards. But what I'm actually doing is that I'm curating an exhibition of Humphrey Spender's work. Humphrey Spender was the younger brother of Stephen Spender, and he worked as the only photographer for mass observation, the sociological study that took place originally largely in Bolton. He was also a full-time painter and a full-time designer, won various awards for his textile designs. And I got to know him because Stephen Spender had taught me at university. So when I did Ackley, I went to recontact him and talk to him about it. And then when I did Isherwood, he said, "Oh, you must speak to Humphrey," and grinned with a very spenderish twinkle in his eye. And of course, it turned out that Humphrey had slept with Isherwood, but then who didn't? And Humphrey was sort of genuinely bisexual, so he had 3 wives, but at the same time was having affairs with men. So he's a really interesting figure. And it's been 20 years since he died, and I've been trying to get an exhibition, and finally at Salisbury Museum are going to do it next year. So that is what I'm doing. So at the moment, I'm doing very unbiographical things. I'm writing to museums and private collectors saying, can we borrow this, that, or the other painting? There will be some sort of catalogue to go with it, with a biographical essay, you'll be surprised to learn. But that is what I'm at the moment. That is the future.
Thank you. So lots to look forward to. Thank you very much for coming this evening and for all your wonderful questions. We're going to move through to the cafe where there'll be a book sale and some wine. And thank you very much, Peter, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for being here.